Welcome to the Passenger Seat Podcast, the podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor, Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm driving back from collecting some axle stands that were found on Facebook Marketplace for my parents. I'm out collecting them partially because the weather is lovely, partially because they were closer to my house than my parents' house, and partially because it's my fault that they needed axle stands in the first place, as I nabbed my dad's spare set when I moved out to be able to grease the trunnions on Peggy, as any Morris Minor owner knows is a very vital job to do. Today's quirk of classic car ownership is how other cars on the road often underestimate the abilities of your car. And this can work kind of both in your favour and against it. I've had it sometimes where I'm coming up to a junction and some people see a classic car pulling up and they think, oh, I can get out here, they're not going to be fast enough for it to be a problem for me. Or I've had it work in that some people kind of let you go thinking that your brakes are not going to work as well as theirs, or things like that. And it's quite an interesting thing to have to get used to, predicting which way people are going to react. Now, today's podcast is a bit of a special one, really. I'm coming up to a year's ownership now of Peggy, so I thought it'd be a really nice thing to reflect on that year's ownership and think about some of the highs, the lows, and some of the things that, having had a year's worth of ownership, I'm looking forward to in the coming year. So to celebrate, I'm bringing you on this little journey along a road that I found quite recently, taking a little diversion back from picking up those axle stands along this really nice quiet road to enjoy driving her and thinking about enjoying her this past year. Say it's quiet and then a car goes past me. Typical. So I think starting the podcast off on a happy foot, we will start with the highs. So the first high that I wanted to talk about is how adult it feels buying your first car. I hadn't bought a car before Peggy. She's the first car that I've bought, and that first drive the next day, there was really kind of a very nervous and giddy mix, and it felt really adult, and I couldn't believe that I was allowed to do it. It was a really strange situation, and I hadn't felt that about anything until kind of buying the house later on that year. But it was a really strange feeling, and it was certainly a high that I look forward to perhaps feeling when I can buy more cars in future. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Another high that came very soon after purchasing Peggy, really, was taking her on a really long trip. I'd done a few long drives before, but to take a car that you've owned for only a month, in my case a classic car, halfway across the country to Wales, and then drive her around Snowdonia National Park and some other really challenging terrains was really a high for me. We had some lows which I'll get onto in that trip as well, but it felt really really good. I really enjoyed it. I was really proud of how well generally she handled the situation, and it made me a very much more confident classic car driver after that. Another high from last year was actually managing to take her to her first show. We had a couple of meets last year with Quest Brothers, a local classic car garage, who did cars and coffee meets, but they also hosted a show in the September, and it was really good to be able to take her to her first show in her first year of ownership, despite everything that has been going on. And it was really nice to be able to talk and interact with a lot of people there as a car owner for the first time, and it really felt like something quite special. Also around that time, I had the joy of getting Peggy her own garage. That felt pretty exciting, and I've enjoyed putting a few signs up and things in her garage, and having that space to do a few bits and bobs and work on her, which is some of the other highs. I managed to change her battery all by myself, which was a huge thrill. I felt really proud of myself for being able to do that. I've done a little bit of work on painting her tyres in that garage, not her tyres, her wheels in that garage, that I was really pretty pleased with the results. It certainly helped improve the look from at least the distance. It's also been really nice to discover all the really cool people and the really good support and help that we've received through various channels in the community. I've managed to find some really cool people online through Instagram and through various Facebook groups that have been so helpful and supportive, and it's been really nice to be able to get involved with that. Another really lovely thing is, I'm sure as any classic car owner can relate, the feeling of people coming up and telling you some really lovely stories. You can't park a classic car up anywhere without anyone coming up to you and saying, oh, so and so used to own one of those, or oh, I remember these when I was growing up, they're such gorgeous cars, and they tell you some really interesting stories. And those interactions, especially when we've been in relative isolation, when I've been able to take her to the supermarket, have really made quite a difference this year, and I look forward to hearing a lot more of them in the coming years. Owning a classic car has also opened up some interesting new conversations with people that I already knew, and it's helped strengthen some of those relationships as well, which has been really lovely, and has definitely given me some more kind of conversation topics, though I am a little bit worried about becoming that annoying car girl that only ever talks about her car. So sorry to anyone who knows me that is the case for. We also had another little win this weekend where I got to work out how to take her door panels off and do a little bit of a fix there with some rattles. I spoke about achieving that in the last podcast, and so hopefully we're going to have a few more wins like that in this ownership. Finally, for the highs that I can think of, and I'm sure there's probably been loads more, is just this past week we went to the beach, and she was parked up on a little drive near the beach, and we were sat behind it having just walked 8 miles across the beach, and we're just having a sit and a relax before we attempted the drive home, and you couldn't really see us from the front of the car, and a group of school kids, I think on some sort of trip, walked past, and one of them said that she was a sick car. Like, that was such a win. I felt it was such a funny thing to overhear. It was the kid just going, that's a well sick car, and to a Morris Minor of all things, because you know there's cooler classic cars out there, at least in their appearance and their appeal, and while the Morris Minor is a beautiful and unique thing, being called sick, it might be the first time in its history, to be honest. Now, I promised you some lows as well. Classic car ownership is certainly not an easy route, and there's certainly been a few lows, and I'm actually quite lucky, I feel, compared to some people. Peggy is a reasonably well-behaved classic car. She, in most cases, tends to get me somewhere when I want to and when I need to. But there is a few occasions where that hasn't been the case. Some of those did happen on our trip in Wales. I think that was a case of having owned her for only a month. I wasn't fully aware of some of her limitations, and trying to go up incredibly steep hills in quite warm weather. She was right to demand a break, to be honest. But we pulled over, and I guess the low wasn't necessarily the fact that we had to pull over because there was some beautiful scenery. It was the kind of stress and embarrassment of having to pull over. But actually people are really quite nice and understanding. So that is a definite positive of it. There was also a slight incident over Christmas which led to me having to change her battery, where she just wasn't starting necessarily when I needed her to, and that was entirely down to a fixable thing, and that was a really quick fix actually. But there was a lot of trial and error to try and work out that the problem wasn't something more serious, and it was such a relief when that wasn't the case. But that stress and nervousness that you sometimes get with a classic car is certainly something that takes a little bit of getting used to. But really that's it for lows for me. Like I said, I've been relatively lucky, and I've heard and seen some absolute disasters and horror stories happening through various Facebook pages and groups that I'm in, and also through some of the friends that I've managed to make. So I'm definitely a very lucky driver in that regard. So as we're going now into my second year of ownership of Peggy, what am I looking forward to? Well, I've got some really exciting things planned. After the excitement and how much I enjoyed the trip to Wales, I'm really pleased that we've booked another holiday where Peggy will be our driver for the trip, mostly because I'll be doing all the driving and I find her so much more comfortable, but also because we've just got to get those shots, right, of our cars in all these wonderful places. On top of that, I've managed to book onto a few more shows this year. In just a few weeks' time from the recording of this podcast, possibly even less by the time of release, I'll be going to the Morris Miners Owners Club picnic, which is really exciting. It'll be so good to start getting even more involved in the scene. And later on in the year, we're hopefully going to be taking part in the Morris Register weekend in Nottingham. So that's really something great to be looking forward to as an owner. We've also got a few more local shows. That means I can spend some time this year with my family and friends at these shows, and that's something that we are really looking forward to. I've also really enjoyed a few meets, especially recently we went to a local one up in Oundle that wasn't too far and was a really nice trip, and it was a nice mix of having some really good food, meeting some people and seeing some really nice cars. So we've been seeking out a few more meets to try and get involved in that scene as well as the kind of show scene, because it's a really different vibe, very chill and enjoyable. And also, as things are hopefully, fingers crossed, starting to open up, work for me is going to go back to a bit more of normality. So I'm going to get to just drive her daily more. I'll be actually driving into the office to deliver my lectures, and so she'll be getting a lot more runs and enjoying those trips even more. I'd love to hear in the comments some of the highs and lows that you've experienced as classic car owners, and also how long you've been a classic car owner, and whether you're using it as a daily or as a show, because I think that makes a big difference as to what your highs and lows are. Thank you so much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.